webinar is Full Employment Now, a conversation with Warwick Smith, who'll be chatting later. Just want to begin with an acknowledgement of country. I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay respect to their elders past and present and recognise that their sovereignty was never ceded. I also recognise those whose ongoing effort to protect and promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures will leave a lasting legacy for future elders and leaders. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of Eora Nation, and this meeting is being held on Aboriginal land across Australia. If you know it, please thread in the chat the land you are on, and if you don't know it, I encourage you to go away from this tonight and find out the beautiful lands you work and live on. So yeah, before I introduce the speakers for tonight, my name is Rafi. I'm the Economic Fairness Campaigner at GetUp and the organiser of this event. I'd also like to explain why we're holding this event tonight. Since the pandemic, we've seen glimpses of what a fair economy could look like. We've seen policies that implemented income support above the poverty line for the first time. We saw policies of free childcare and policies of eviction moratoriums. But at the same time, we saw that a Conservative government can rip away what they've just given. JobSeeker will be cut in 1 week and then cut completely by December. Free childcare wasn't just ripped away, but so were the wage subsidies of childcare workers across the country, predominantly female, migrant and low paid. And eviction moratoriums weren't enforced, throwing many renters under the bus. And with Australia now formally in a recession, we are looking at unemployment rates not seen since the Great Depression, with more than 2 million Australians under threat of joblessness by the end of the year. What we're seeing is a dogged commitment to neoliberal austerity, a combination of market fundamentalism, a complete disdain for a social safety net, and cruelty enacted by powerful elites. It's in this context of this crisis that we have to act. And to act, we need strategy. We need vision and we need tactics that can achieve this vision. This series of conversations is about doing just that, hearing from the thinkers, activists, and organisers who are fighting from a transformation of society to one where the economy serves all of us, not just the rich. And also importantly, to hear from each other as the members of a social movement fighting for a fair, flourishing, and just future for all. So yeah, tonight is the first in the series of conversations with renowned economist Warwick Smith of the Castlemaine Institute. And tonight we'll also be hearing from Kristen O'Connell from the Australian Unemployed Workers Union. First, Warwick will give a 20-minute presentation based on a paper he's written about climate change, employment and money in the new economy, busting myths about government deficit and unemployment. Then Kristen from the AUWU, of the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, will talk about the work their union has been doing on bettering the lives of unemployed people, including their important campaigns on challenging the predatory private unemployment agency system, JobActive, and the punitive job-seeking requirements of mutual obligations. After this, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions to the panelists. So remember to get your questions in during the talks and remember to say who the question is for. Finally, we'll wrap up with an action we can all do to start our journey of achieving a fairer job system in this country. And then after we wrap up, we'll break you off into groups to debrief about the webinar and how you found it. And just a few online norms. With this many people in a meeting, we'll mute everyone, otherwise it could become a bit too many people talking at the same time. We'll be using breakout groups towards the end, so you can have a bit more time to chat together. And we'll give more information on norms in these breakout sessions before we do them. And feel free to use the chat function to talk to each other. The presenters might not have time to look at all your messages, but please feel free to ask questions for the Q&A session. So with that being said, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, Warwick Smith. Before Warwick starts, I just want to introduce him a bit more. Warwick is an economist, writer, and policy analyst. His current professional interests include employment, inclusive and sustainable economic development, democracy, and climate change. He also has a background in evolutionary and conservation biology. A regular speaker at conferences and in the media, he also publishes opinion pieces in outlets such as The Guardian, The Age, and The Conversation. Warwick is an honorary fellow at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne and a research fellow at policy think tank Per Capita. He holds a Bachelor of Sciences and Honours, Bachelor of Arts, and is a co-founder of the Castlemaine Institute, which has partnered with GetUp to counter the economic myths the government is using to drive us back into austerity. So Warwick, over to you.
Thanks, Rafi. And thanks everyone for coming along. It's really great to see so many people interested in this topic. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I am here in central Victoria, the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and to those all across the country. It's worth noting in the context of this event that there was no such thing as unemployment on this continent prior to Europeans arriving, prior to colonisation. It might seem a trite thing to say, given there was also no employment, but I do think that there are really important things, important lessons that we can learn from the notion that if there's work to be done, if there's contributions to be made, and there are people who are willing and able to do it, then we should have a culture that facilitates that. I really just want to make 3 points today. The first point is that reaching and maintaining full employment is achievable. We've done it before and we can do it again. My second point is that full employment is not a goal that we seek purely for the unemployed. While obviously it's beneficial to unemployed people, full employment increases the power of workers. And this increase in power increases pay and conditions for all workers across the country. And lastly, there's no trade-off between reaching zero net emissions and achieving full employment. We can have a thriving, prosperous economy with full employment during and after our transition to a climate-safe society. Unemployment, and when I talk about unemployment, I'm also talking about underemployment in this talk, which is when people have less work than they would like, is primarily caused by a lack of demand for labour. This might sound obvious, but it's a really critical point. There are many more unemployed people than there are jobs. This was true before COVID and has been true for decades. If every unemployed person was the ideal job candidate with the perfect CV and immaculately dressed, always punctual, hardworking, the unemployment rate would be exactly what it is today. It's really worth taking some time, I think, to let that sink in. If unemployment is not caused by the unemployed, but by a lack of demand for labour, why do we insist on all these mutual obligations that unemployed workers are forced to perform in order to receive their miserly unemployment benefits? The most powerful bargaining chip that workers have is to threaten to walk away. If you're easily replaced and being unemployed involves living in poverty, being treated as a bludger, and being made to do pointless tasks, you're a lot less likely to push for better wages and better conditions. And similarly, if you're unemployed, you're much more likely to accept poor wages and poor conditions because you're so desperate to get out of the hell that is unemployment. The reality is that a punitive employment services system and starvation rates of unemployment benefits are not about getting unemployed people into work. They're about suppressing the wages of those in employment. The whole dole bludger rhetoric is about enlisting workers in the campaign to suppress their own wages. Let's run a short thought experiment, see if we can get to the heart of how this works. Imagine that this event tonight is being held in a physical theatre. And when you came in, all of you were given 50 tokens. These tokens represent your wages in the thought experiment. The tokens can be used either in an auction for 100 fascinating books on money, employment, and the new economy, or you use them to bid for the time of wait staff to bring you drinks and snacks. just to reiterate, you've got an app on your phone with 50 tokens on it. You can also see other people's bids, and you can put a bid on a book or multiple books or for food and drinks. You're each going to make your own value judgments about what you want and bid accordingly. The prices of the books and the wages of the staff are going to be the result of these choices. Okay, now imagine there are 200 people serving food and drinks. That's about 1 for every 2 people here. In that scenario, there would always be plenty of staff available, many of whom would not have any work. Pretty soon, you'd notice that some people are offering just 1 token for delivery, and the staff are competing to accept that single token because it's better than making nothing. Not much would end up getting spent on food and drinks, and a relatively large proportion of the tokens would end up getting spent on the books, which are in fixed supply. If we instead decided to give you 75 tokens, which is a pay rise, the wages of the wait staff are unlikely to rise much, if at all. Because even though more of you may decide to buy food and drink, there are still more than enough staff to bring you everything you need. And taking 1 token per delivery is still better than not getting anything. However, the price of the books, because there's more money there, is going to go up because there's only 100 of them. I don't want to lose anybody here, so let's just recap. The oversupply of the waiting staff means they are desperate for work and will accept very low wages because the alternative is getting nothing. The main point of this part of the thought experiment is to reach an intuitive understanding that the impact of a pool of desperate unemployed people has on wages. Those who can get work are ready to accept poor pay and conditions because they know they're lucky to have work and they're easily replaced. All right, now imagine that we reduce the pool of potential wait staff down to 20 for 400 odd people. Suddenly, the tokens going to each of the wait staff are going to dramatically increase because there are some people who are going to be really hungry, some who really want to drink, and some who don't read books. So similarly, with only 20 staff, if we gave you that 25 token pay rise from 50 to 75, that extra money is going to be spread between wages and books instead of essentially going all to the books. This thought experiment is a very simplified model of the real economy, where the starting tokens are disposable income, the wait staff are the unemployed and underemployed, and the books are real estate and other relatively fixed assets like shares. It's okay if you didn't entirely follow that. We're going to come back to it and flesh it out a bit more. Our current model of economic management deliberately maintains a pool of desperate unemployed workers, specifically for the purpose of suppressing wages, conditions, and inflation. However, this same system actually creates asset price inflation, including the price of housing. When I say that our system intentionally maintains a pool of unemployed workers, there's no conspiracy theory sitting behind that, and it's not reliant on kind of secret behind closed doors decision making. It's actually based in, it's baked into the economic theory that's taught in our universities and dominates in Treasury and in the Reserve Bank. There's a term that only an economist could come up with called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or the NIRU. In neoclassical economic theory, the NIRU is the rate of unemployment below which workers will have too much bargaining power. And when they've got too much bargaining power, they'll be able to demand wage rises that go above productivity. And what that means is that workers are getting compensated more, their wages are rising faster than their capacity to produce goods and services. The inevitable result of this is inflation. And what that means is there's too much money chasing too few goods and services, and that's what inflation is. So one of our government's explicit economic management goals is to keep unemployment above the Nauru in order to avoid inflation. So, what level of unemployment is the Nauru? This is where our economic theory falls down a bit. Nobody really knows how to calculate the Nauru. They can only estimate it through models. In recent Australian history, the Nauru has been assumed to be an unemployment rate of about 5%. Now, you don't need to understand all the economics that's sitting behind that. All you really have to take in is that we intentionally maintain a pool of unemployed people in our economy in order to keep inflation low. We then demonize them and harass them for not being in jobs that don't exist. It's a nice system, isn't it? We haven't always sacrificed 5% of our workforce to appease the inflation gods. This particular superstition is only about 40 years old. From the end of World War II to the early 1970s, a period often called the post-war boom, unemployment in Australia averaged just under 2%. The history of the war and the post-war boom is very relevant to our situation today. And the way that policy makers dealt with the end of the war could teach us a lot about how we come out of the COVID recession. Towards the end of the war, policymakers in Australia were starting to plan for the post-war economy. They lived through the Great Depression, and then they lived through the war. In the Great Depression, unemployment was 20%. During the war, it was effectively zero. They wondered to themselves, if we can have full employment during the war through government expenditure, why can't we have full employment during peacetime through government expenditure? They set out their plan to achieve exactly that in a 1945 white paper on full employment, published by the Curtin government. The white paper discusses the costs and benefits of a market-based capitalist economy. And they concluded that if we want the benefits of such a system, then we should take some responsibility for the costs. And one of those costs is unemployment. Acknowledging that unemployment is caused by a lack of private demand for labour, they committed to fill that gap through government expenditure. This government commitment to always spending enough to maintaining full employment kept unemployment at around 2% for 25 years. And remember that now we say we can't get unemployment below about 5% or will cause out of control inflation. It's worth noting that Australia finished the war with the highest level of government debt in our history. How then did we afford to maintain full employment and pay off all that debt? Given the current rhetoric from political leaders from both sides of the narrow political divide about the burden of government debt on future generations, you may be surprised by the answer. We never paid off the World War II debt. Post-war governments of both parties ran essentially constant deficits during the 25 years following the war. At the same time, debt to GDP ratios were falling sharply. That is, the debt was growing, but the economy was growing faster. Economic growth plus inflation eroded the debt burden down to what was a trivial level by the 1970s. Even while governments were running constant deficits. During the 25 years of the post-war boom, we had rapidly rising material standards of living, we had increasing public health and education, and falling inequality. That is, the share of economic output going to the rich was falling, and the share going to workers was increasing. Remember that last part, because it has important implications and consequences. With all of this in mind, let's return to our thought experiment. We're going to jump in the deep end now and make our whole thought experiment a bit more like the real economy. First, we'll add businesses. We now have a for-profit business that serves the food and drinks. They employ as many of the wait staff as they think they need out of the 200 unemployed workers. We'll also allow the staff and unemployed workers to order food and drink themselves and also bid for books with the tokens that they earn. In this economic model, the business owners will be looking for profit. They know that the wait staff will work for a single token because there are so many of them and they're desperate. They also know from experience that setting the price of an order at 10 tokens will maximise their income. They pay 1 token to their staff, and they make 9 as profit. Now, the government, that's me, brings in a minimum wage of 5 tokens per order. The business will now make 5 tokens, the worker will make 5 per order. The amount of trades will go up though, as some of the wait staff use their extra incomes to order food and drinks. The result will be the employment of more wait staff, who will in turn have more tokens to spend. Economists call this flow-on effect of employment creating more employment the multiplier effect. One last addition to the thought experiment, and I think we'll have pushed it as far as we can. Imagine now that I, as the government, offer a job, cleaning up or taking tickets or otherwise looking after the venue and patrons at a rate equivalent to 5 tokens per order to any of the unemployed who want a job. I'll also pay 3 per order, equivalent to unemployed workers who would rather keep trying to get work and serving food and drinks. Now everybody's got money to spend, and the number of orders for food and drinks goes up sharply, with the multiplier effect meaning that even more workers are needed. In this scenario, to lure workers away from working for me for 5 tokens, the food and drink company will have to pay 6 tokens an order, leaving themselves with 4 as profit. There are very likely very few workers who are unemployed on 3 tokens in this scenario, and not very many on the job guarantee, because the multiplier effect has given many workers a 6 token pay rate that they're then spending on food and drinks and creating more employment. So, by stepping in to guarantee work to anyone who wants it, the government, me, has dramatically boosted the economic activity in the venue and increased the number of people privately employed by the company. This really is how a service-based economy operates. Lots of people offering lots of different services to each other. It can seem a little bit like a magic pudding, but it really works because a single dollar can keep travelling around and around. Okay, I think that's enough with the overstretched thought experiment. If you followed me all the way through, don't worry if you didn't, it's not critical. You should now have a decent high-level understanding of how the level of unemployment affects worker pay and conditions. For the sake of simplicity, the thought experiment left out one very important element, which is unions or organised labour. By banding together and acting collectively, workers can shift the power imbalance between themselves and employers. Unions fighting for better pay and better conditions have the same multiplier effect as we saw in our thought experiment. These things benefit the entire economy, including the wages and conditions of those beyond the union in question. It's important to note that unions were very strong during the post-war boom. Excuse me, I think I've been talking too much today. In our thought experiment, by offering guaranteed employment, the government took away some of the power advantage that the employer had over workers. This is effectively what the governments of both political parties did to create full employment during the post-war boom. There wasn't an explicit job guarantee, but there was an implicit one created through sufficient government expenditure. If you wanted to work and you were able to work, you could turn up at places like rail yards and be given a job. If you didn't have the skills required or there weren't jobs in your area, you'd be assisted with training or with moving expenses. The reason I think that an explicit job guarantee is a good idea now is that we have another task on our hands beyond recovering from the COVID recession and achieving full employment. It's decarbonising the economy. While it might seem a lot to do at once, I think COVID has actually demonstrated our capacity and our willingness to make radical changes quickly when necessary. This is the perfect time to move rapidly to a zero net emissions economy. I also think, under the current circumstances and within our current political landscape, that a carbon price is the best way to rapidly decarbonise. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail now. You can read a bit more about it in my paper that I think is being published over the next couple of days as part of this series. But I advocate for a carbon fee and dividend system where we charge emitters a high carbon fee, maybe $100 per tonne, and then we divide all the proceeds up and return it to all Australian citizens and permanent residents as a dividend. Prices of lots of things will rise, but people will have enough cash to afford them. The University of New South Wales did some modelling on a system like this with a $50 price tag, and they found that low-income families were about $1,300 a year better off on average due to the dividend. And that's because wealthy households consume much more goods and services that produce high emissions. So they bear a greater tax than low-income families. And as a result, receive more in dividend than they pay in tax. This high price would create a strong incentive for basically everyone in the economy to reduce their emissions, for consumers to consume less emission-intensive products, and for producers to rapidly decarbonise their supply chains. This transition, though, can't be made painless. A rapid transition would destroy entire industries and leave some towns and regions without major employers. Given we would be choosing to implement policies that destroy livelihoods, we have a collective responsibility to look after those individuals who lose their jobs. They should be offered training, generous unemployment benefits, assistance with relocating if they want to do so, and when all else fails, they should be offered a job at the relevant award rate by the government. This job guarantee, which would be available to any unemployed worker who wanted it, will act just like it did in our thought experiment. It will give otherwise unemployed workers greater disposable income, which they can spend on goods and services. This in turn will result in greater private employment. Even though we're stimulating economic activity, at the same time, we're also creating a very strong incentive to decarbonise. So the net effect should be strongly towards a sustainable economy. Once the economy stabilises in the post-carbon era, there'll be relatively few job guarantee workers because they'll have moved into private enterprise or other standard public service positions. Just like in our thought experiment. However, the guarantee would remain in place to act as a floor on wages and conditions in the private sector. When a secure, guaranteed job is always available from the government with decent pay and conditions, it's very difficult for employers to get away with wage theft or any kind of legal or illegal heavy-handed tactics. Before I finish, I think it's important to complete the historical story. We saw that the post-war boom saw rising living standards, 2% unemployment, and falling inequality for 25 years. As I flagged earlier, that last part is of particular significance. Falling inequality means more of our total economic output going to workers and less going to the owners of capital, the rich. A similar trend was occurring around the world as a result, among other things, of Keynesian economic management. Well, it turns out that the rich didn't like their share of economic output falling. They constructed a whole new theory of economic management, funding entire economics departments at prestigious universities. They enlisted business leaders and politicians around the world as champions of this new system, and then they waited for an opportunity to paint the Keynesian consensus as a failure. That opportunity came in the 1970s with the OPEC oil shocks that sent oil prices skyrocketing and most other prices along with them. The result was a stagnating economy combined with high inflation, known as stagflation. Keynesian economics had no ready answer, and into the breach leapt economic rationalism, or neoliberalism, as it's now often called. Within a very short space of time, we went from treating unemployment as a collective problem to treating it as an individual failure. By doing this, we could blame the unemployed for their plight, treat them badly, and abandon government commitments to full employment. The results of these changes are there for all to see. Since this occurred in the 1970s and 80s, the share of Australia's economic output going to the top 1% of earners has been steadily rising. Meanwhile, despite 3 decades of constant economic growth, the share of output going to wages has been in steady decline over the same period. To quote US billionaire Warren Buffett, "There is a class war, and my side is winning." Our economic system over the last 40 years, under both major parties, has been operated primarily for the benefit of the rich. We're a very affluent society, and so it's easy not to see what's happening if you have a comfortable middle-class job. But try being unemployed or underemployed and attempting to live a decent life in one of our capital cities. There are cracks in the system appearing everywhere. Older women are our fastest growing group of homeless people in Australia. Wages have hardly grown for a decade. House prices continue to ludicrous heights, primarily benefiting those who own more than one property. A very substantial number of people are becoming aware that the economic rationalist system, whose mantra is gain wealth, forgetting all but self, creates an unhealthy society. The beacon of economic rationalism, the United States, is currently imploding. Bizarrely, our government and our dominant economic system continues to lead us down this path, with greater reliance on private provision of services and a reduced role for government. We've seen where it takes us, but we're going there anyway. A genuine push for full employment can bring us into the post-COVID boom. This post-COVID boom could be a boom for renewable energy, a boom for housing affordability, a boom in collective responsibility. We could come out the other side with a standard full-time working week of 20 hours, vibrant communities, vibrant democracies, a thriving natural environment, and a safe climate. We already know how to do all of those things. It's just a matter of choosing them and starting to do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Warwick. I can see a lot of people clapping in the gallery view. So, if we were in real life, we would hear rapturous applause across the auditorium. So thank you for the great presentation. I think it's also a great opportunity for viewers to put in the chat any reflections they have, or even what interested them in coming to the event to hear this talk, any life experiences or people that inspire them into caring about justice in employment. Also remember that if you have any questions for Warwick or the upcoming panelists, please thread it in the chat and maybe let us know that it's for the Q&A. Already seeing some questions like, why isn't Josh Frydenberg listening to this chat? And for all we know, maybe he is. There's a lot of people here, but we all agree, like, you should be listening more to economists like Warwick Smith and organizations like GetUp. So our next speaker, Kristen O'Connell from the Australian Unemployed Workers Union. Kristen is an anti-poverty activist and acting communications coordinator with the Australian Unemployed Workers Union. In her role, she works with other volunteers in the union to provide direct support to people who rely on income support payments, organises grassroots activists, communicates government policy changes, and fights back against job agency abuse of job seekers and counters harmful myths about unemployed workers. Kristen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rafi. I'm just confirming everyone can hear me, yeah? Thumbs up? Great, thank you so much. So as Rafi said, I'm an unwaged worker from the Australian Unemployed Workers Union. That's not a misnomer. We do need a union, we are workers. I'm joining you from Gadigal country today in the Eora Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past and present, and I thank them for their custodianship of these lands. I also wanted to thank Warwick for giving us something I hope we can aspire to and start working towards after we wrap up this evening. And thank you GetUp for having me, and Rafi for organising. It's a really cool event to be involved with. So I'm going to talk about what it means when we have unemployment. So a little bit more detail about that Warwick alluded to about what it is like for those of us living on income support. And just to be clear, I am currently on the disability support pension. I have previously been on what was New Start and is now called Job Seeker. I've also been fortunate to be in really good jobs and be paid well. And I think that's a good illustration for people that maybe we don't all fit the stereotype that the government tries to promote about so-called dole bludgers. So yeah, I'll also talk a bit about what we've been doing to support people more broadly who are on these payments and you know, what we're doing to help them fight back against it. So thank you very much as well for coming and listening and learning about what's going on for those of us trying to deal with the system and how we're going to change it. So I just wanted to start by talking about who is on these payments, because as I kind of just mentioned, it's a little bit misunderstood, and certainly the media doesn't help by kind of perpetuating the myths that are convenient for the government and business to put out there into the public. So right now, you've probably heard there's about 1.6 million people on unemployment payments. The main one used to be called New Start, but it is now called Job Seeker. It doesn't make a difference to people who get the payment. It's literally just a rebrand, surely probably quite an expensive one that they've thrown some money away on. So before COVID, these payments were at half the poverty line, and that's about $40 per day. And just for context, I want you to take yourselves back, if you can remember it, to 1994. And in 1994, the equivalent payment was $275 per week. So, you know, I don't know what it was like to live on that in 1994. But no, what I want to tell you is that right now, the government's plan is that from 1 January 2021, everyone living on these payments will be getting $275 per week. So if you just take a moment to think about the cost of your mortgage, or maybe the cost of buying a home, if you're fortunate to already have a home, what you would be paying now compared to what you might have been paying in 1994. The cost of rent, or to think about the cost of food. What was your grocery bill like in 1994? I can't imagine that there's any person on this call who's spending the same amount of money now as they were then, but that's what's being demanded of people who aren't in employment. So this is why you will just hear about people skipping meals. Those stories aren't exaggerated, they're real. You know, information last year showed that people living on youth allowance, which is slightly lower than Job Seeker, 9 out of 10 people were skipping meals. And for people on Job Seeker, that was 8 out of 10. So you can see that marginal difference in the rate meant that 10% more people were eating properly. Maybe not even eating properly, but eating a regular number of meals, but probably not great food because you can't afford it. So of the 1.6 million people on payments right now, obviously about half of those have come into the system since March because of the pandemic. And so the number of people relying on this poverty payment has doubled. But yeah, the 800,000 people who were on the payment before, some things you might not know, some myths that are out there. We'll just debunk those now. So about 45% of people were actually over the age of 45. So they're not old enough to be on the pension, so they're stuck on this unemployment payment. And that's about 360,000 people over the age of 45 living on half the poverty line. More than 20,000 people are older than 65. So, you know, it wasn't so long ago that that was the retirement age and when you could start to receive the age pension. Now, the age pension is not great, but it is, you know, substantially higher, relatively speaking, than job seeker. It's still below the poverty line, but it is a little less brutal. So that's 20,000 people who really should be on the pension. The other thing that you might not know is that 40 to 45% of people who were on job seeker before the pandemic are disabled or they have a chronic illness. So there are so many barriers to employment that have nothing to do even with the fact that there are no jobs. There's other things that make it difficult to get into work and to maintain work. So many of those people should be on the disability support pension like me. And the rules were changed in 2011 to make that much, much harder. So that's why people are stuck on this payment. It's because the government is actively trying to prevent people to get on the pension when they do actually need that support. So only about 15% of those 800,000 people are under 25. And obviously the thing that we like to, or the stories that we get told, is that so many people are young slackers who can't be bothered to work and they'd rather just laze about. They've got no motivation. And that's just, excuse my language, it's bullshit. So you might have a kid or a nephew or a niece or some other young person in your life who is trying to live on these payments. And that's really horrifying because in the system, being in the system can have really long-term and very negative effects on your career prospects. So if you're stuck in it young, that's grim. But actually, you're probably, like statistically, you're more likely to know someone who's closer to retirement age, who's struggling to survive on the payments and living with all of that indignity that the government dishes out as punishment for the fact that you don't have a job, which they have failed to make sure exists. So there's this idea that people who lost work during the pandemic lost that work through no fault of their own. And I think Warwick's done a really good job of explaining like that that's just not the case, right? This is intentional. It's part of the design of the system where essentially we're just fodder, we're grist for the mill to make sure that, you know, bosses can keep wages down. And yeah, we're really just being used actually. So conservatively before COVID, the estimates was there about 8 people on an unemployment payment for every job. And, you know, probably more realistic estimates put that much higher, sort of around 13 at a very minimum. And so the jobs that are available is a problem as well. Not only are there not enough jobs, but jobs that are being advertised aren't all being advertised that fit exactly the profile of someone who's on a payment. So it's not necessarily realistic if you've got barriers to employment that you can just apply for a job as a manager at a marketing company. Like that's not realistic. So many people are looking for entry-level work because, you know, they don't have the experience level or whatever other thing they need. They might not have a driver's license and just be able to get to where the job is. So it's also about access to jobs where you are. In Victoria, in regional Victoria, there are actually 30 people on payments for the number of jobs available as of, you know, stats that came out very recently. And there's regional variation like that all over the country. So of course there's the age discrimination, especially for older folks. There's gender discrimination, which is why we have so many older women who, you know, becoming homeless and being stuck in that situation because they're just discriminated against on every front. And disability discrimination, as we know, huge number of people are disabled in this system. So just based on those figures, you can see that it was already impossible to expect many people on payments to get a job, particularly a good job. And so, yeah, that number has doubled. And as of today, on Seek, there are 130,000 jobs advertised. And that's 14 people trying to survive on income support for every job that's there. And we use that number because the information the government, like the ABS, puts out about jobs that are available is actually based on a survey. And this is just a real number. If you're a person looking for a job, you're going to jump onto Seek. That's where you're going to be looking. That's what you're going to find. So in reality, like, again, the entry-level jobs were receiving hundreds of applicants before COVID. And now, you know, that's obviously out of control. Like, there was a job not that long ago advertised for Boost Juice, and it received 3,500 applicants. The highest example that I've seen in the last few months was a job that had 14,000 applicants. So yeah, sorry, it's pretty depressing to talk about, actually. So the government's saying, like, these are transitional payments, right? Like, we can force people to starve just for a few weeks because starving for a few weeks is fine, right? That's their argument. And that's how they justify the starvation rate and the punitive employment services system. But clearly they're not transitional payments. Like, there just are not enough jobs. I am going to keep saying that because it is the most important message of tonight, is that everyone takes away from this, that there just are no jobs. So yeah, in 2014, which is when the current version of employment services started to come in, around then, people were on payments on average for 2 years and 2 months. Quite a bit different to when there was full employment. Now, the current employment services system has been going for about 5 or 6 years, and in 2019, the average time that people were stuck on payments was longer than 3 years. So we weren't in a recession during that period. It's very clear that this employment services system is an utter failure if its aim is to put people in work. People are out of work longer and longer, trying to survive on these payments for longer and longer. And that has just got such a horrific toll on people's health and mental well-being as well. So even during COVID, the payment was actually doubled. And it was, you know, there's a lot of talk about that meaning people aren't taking jobs, but it's still actually $200 a week below the minimum wage. And it's still on the poverty line. So people don't like to live in poverty. And during the pandemic, while that was the case, no one was being forced to look for work to get their payment. So at the same time as all that was happening, you would think, sure, everyone's sitting at home, luxuriating in their free time, but actually Seek reported that there were more applications for every job than they have ever seen before. And, you know, we have heard from our members and from, you know, people in the community who are living on payments that the fact that the payment was higher and the fact that they didn't have to do all these demeaning mutual obligations actually meant that for the first time, they felt really equipped to apply for jobs that they would actually have a chance of getting, to you know, spend more time looking for work and finding the right type of work, or even just doing stuff at home that would help develop their skills so they could apply for jobs in their area. All those kinds of things that you just don't have the energy to do when you're living with the anxiety and the stress and the lack of nutrition of trying to live on the ordinary income support payment in that employment services system. So we actually need jobs, not paternalism. We don't need anyone to police our behaviour. We want to get out there and work. We just need to have the conditions to do it and the jobs to go to. So the unemployment services system, I call it the unemployment services system, sorry, I just slip into that because it doesn't get anyone a job. So what's it like being in that? Again, I'm going to talk about before COVID, and that's what we're headed back to, right? So the government has made an announcement last week that as of Monday, most of these rules that used to be in place before March are coming back. So with all those things changing on Monday, what people can expect, including me, because people on the disability support pension actually do have to do these mutual obligations until they're 35, when we magically, our disability just becomes worse and suddenly we no longer have these requirements. So this is applying to more than just the people who are on the job seeker payment. So the requirements are called mutual obligations, but they're obviously not mutual. We're forced to do them. And if you don't do them, you won't get your poverty payment. So if you're already not eating enough, you're certainly going to starve if you don't do these awful activities that they force you into. So you get connected to a job agency or an unemployment agency, again, as I like to call them. They do something really awful called parking and creaming. What that means is that if they decide you have a pretty good chance of getting a job, then they spend as little effort as possible on you. That means it costs very little to have you on their books. And even if you find yourself a job, they get an outcome payment. So they don't care that they haven't done anything for you, they still get paid. And then there are people the job agency decides don't have good prospects. They make a judgment call about people on payments. You know, it might be on, it's almost certainly on the basis of something the person doesn't have control over. So like where you live, whether you have a driving license, your education level, your age, a disability or a health condition. And if you're in the group that they decide it's too hard for you to get a job or you're not very likely to get one, then they just work on figuring out how to make the most money possible out of you. And that means cycling you in and out of the system into terrible jobs that are short term, that bring you back onto their books over and over again, you know, again, into terrible jobs that are not good for you while you do them, don't pay you fairly while you do them. And then you're going in between that system. You know, often wage theft is the outcome of that. People being in really unsafe working conditions as well, and just tolerating it because the payment is so grim that it's still better than being on a payment. And they get shoved back into the system again anyway, because those jobs don't last. So normally, got to do 20 job applications a month. It's a crazy number. At the moment, it'll be 8 under the new rules coming in next week, so slightly less awful. There'll be millions of people applying for these jobs. It's very demoralizing to know that your prospects are so slim, or to know that you have to apply for a job you're not qualified for just to meet this quota. And so you're setting yourself up to get that rejection again and again. And the sheer number of applications is enormous. It's a waste of time and energy for job seekers, but it also contributes to mental ill health. And it's a huge waste of time for the businesses who are flooded with these applications from people who aren't a good fit for the job they're trying to fill. So another activity you might be forced to go to is pointless training courses. They make the job agencies money as well. You might be taught what types of clothes you should wear or how you should speak. And again, just imagine that you're a woman in your 50s, you've probably worked quite a bit in your life, but for whatever reason, maybe you were made redundant, your employer went out of business, you're stuck in this system and someone's teaching you how to talk. You know, what is this about? It's so ridiculous. Often we hear from people that they've been teaching the instructor something rather than the other way around. It's very condescending and it's very demeaning. They also force people into volunteering work, forced volunteering work, which means free labour for the organisations that participate. And that includes a lot of really big charities. So, you know, before you make your donation next time, just check whether they're benefiting from this type of forced labour. And then the final part of the system, and the very worst part of the system, is called work for the dole. And that means for an extra $10 a week in your income support, you might be forced to go and do hard labour. And that's creating value for the organisation that you do it for. You get as little as 40 cents per hour for that work, because many people, particularly younger people, are required to do 25 hours a week of that work for that $10. So the job agencies make money out of putting you in that program. The organisation gets paid to take you in that program, and you get 40 cents an hour. So you get nothing. It's dangerous, and last year Ernst & Young did a report that found that 64% of the sites that people get put into for work for the dole didn't meet required health and safety standards. Those sites didn't get shut down. They're still operating, 64%. And you might have heard of this story. It's absolutely heartbreaking. In 2016, there was a young guy called Josh Parkthing in Toowoomba, and Josh was put into a really dangerous situation. He actually died on a work for the dole site. And took the government nearly 4 years to release that report. They did it in April, in the midst of pandemic fever. So we're really worried about the government's plan for this program. You've probably seen the news stories of David Littleproud, the Agriculture Minister, complaining that the fruit's going to rot on the vine. And they're already talking about sending young people out to do this labour on farms while they're on a job seeker payment. It's unthinkable. It shouldn't happen anywhere, and it shouldn't happen to anyone. Those jobs do not have fair paying conditions, and the migrant workers who normally have to do them are paid well below minimum wage, and it's very unsafe working environment. It's absolutely shameful, and the government relies on people to not know that it is happening in order for the people running those farms to get away with it. So we're very afraid about what happened to people if they do get forced to leave their community and their family and friends and all of their other supports to be sent far away into these brutal jobs on their half the poverty line payment. So I think that's kind of enough about the system. I guess one really important story that I'll just go back to that's come out of the pandemic is how the change in the rate and the lifting of those requirements has made so many people feel empowered to look for work or to develop their skills. That's because they've had all this stress and anxiety of trying to cope with all this stuff going on. And they haven't had to deal with toxic job agencies. They haven't had to deal with trying to have energy without having enough food. And I haven't even had time to go into all of the horrific mental and physical health effects that people experience when trying to survive in the system. Particularly, I mean, if you read about the job agencies, how they conduct themselves generally, and particularly during the pandemic, they bully, they harass, they threaten, they intimidate people. It's absolutely awful. In the Saturday paper a couple of weeks ago, Rick Morton reported that they will make $500 million. They will take $500 million of public money this year. So that's all of us as taxpayers paying for this torture and abuse and this punishment of people, again, who all of whom, through no fault of their own, aren't working or aren't in paid work. Actually, we didn't even get into the fact that a lot of labour isn't compensated and all of us are working, we're just not in waged work. So that $500 million is going to private job agencies. Many billionaires come out of that system, and that's while the rate is being slashed back down to half the poverty line. So we know there are no jobs. So we'd like to know, what are the job agencies being paid for if there are no jobs? And that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Kristen, for that really powerful and incisive speech about what it's like to be on JobSeeker and the work the AUW is currently doing. If the audience has time as well, why not let us know any actions or conversations that you've engaged in about challenging the stigma and abuse of unemployed people. I can see the chat's going off, so maybe that conversation is already happening, but we'd love to hear more about any work you've done in this area. So we'll start off with, move on to the Q&A session. So please feel free to keep asking your questions, but my colleague has sort of grouped them together and will be asking the panelists soon about their thoughts to your questions. But I'd like to start off with one. Kristen, you mentioned that you don't have time to go into talking about some of the physical and mental health impacts of going through the mutual obligation system. We actually have an action coming up that we'll talk about soon about the job active agencies. So would you be able to briefly describe some of these impacts?
Yeah, thanks, Rafi. And I actually had a presentation that I wanted to share with you all that I didn't get time to go into, so I'll try and do that in a minute now. The job agency's behaviour is just absolutely disgusting. And so we actually called a strike a few weeks ago now, on the 4th of August, to protest the abuse that they dish out to people. So, one example of a story, well, actually, it's not one story. There's been absolutely rampant lying directly to job seekers. So I mentioned that mutual obligations were suspended throughout the pandemic, and that's obviously to protect everyone's health and well-being. It's to make sure that the virus isn't transmitted. It's to make sure that people aren't put into vulnerable situations where they contract it themselves. And during this time, job agencies were sending emails, text messages, constant phone calls to job seekers saying, you have to do this, you have to do that, when that was not the case at all. They are just so shameless because they do not get penalised. So we know that between March and July of this year, 1,300 complaints were submitted to the Employment Department about job agencies bullying, abusing and lying to people. We at the union, we run a helpline. So anyone who's got a problem with their job agency can call us and ask us for help and support, understand their rights, because the job agencies do not tell people their rights. So that's the kind of behaviour we're dealing with. We have people so intimidated by these job agencies that we had a guy last week he didn't call us. He asked his sister to call us and provide an anonymous report to us about something that was happening with his job agency. And I can't share it with you because he asked us not to talk about it. All I can share with you is that fear that he has because of how afraid he is of losing his payment. Keeping in mind, he didn't have to be doing the thing that he was calling us up about. And he knew that, but he was too afraid to say no.
Thanks, Kristen. That's a really powerful story. I might move over to hand it over to Tosca to read out some of the other questions that have been provided to panelists. Take it away, Tosca.
Thanks, Rafi. Hi, everyone. My name's Tosca and I'm a campaigner here at Get Up. Thank you both for those presentations. So we've had a few questions on degrowth, in particular from Karen Jones and Madhu, and I'm going to read out Madhu's question now. How do we apply this? This is for Warwick, and also Kristen, if you want to feed in after as well, that'd be great. How do we apply this framework to a degrowth model, as degrowth is necessary for climate justice? Infinite economic growth is unsustainable.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my personal view about degrowth, while I think the degrowth movement is really great and lots of the arguments they make are really great, I feel like the degrowth thing falls into the same trap that growth obsession falls into, that growth in a sense is a distraction. So just for an explanation, there are sort of, there's quite a strong movement out there saying that we've been obsessed with economic growth, and it's economic growth that's causing environmental destruction, including climate change and lots of other problems. And as a result, what we actually have to do is degrow the economy. We've got to shrink the size of the economy. And I think personally that what we should be doing is focusing on the actual goals that we want. So we should be focusing on sustainability, we should be focusing on social justice, we should be focusing on race relations, and deciding what our goals are with those things and measuring them. And if we can achieve a sort of sustainable and socially just society and the economy grows, that's fine. If we do that and the economy shrinks, that's okay too. I feel like the sort of degrowth as a goal is a sort of oppositional framing. Well, we know that the sort of obsession with growth at all costs is causing all these problems. Therefore, we'll oppose growth and we'll have degrowth. Whereas I think that both things fall into the same sort of problematic thinking of focusing on growth instead of focusing on the actual social and environmental goals that we want. So I think I really understand, and I'm very sympathetic, and and I have friends and colleagues who are sort of degrowth economists, but that's kind of where I fall into in my own thinking. And I think if we can, like I was talking about with the climate and carbon pricing, if we can create the right incentives to reduce our impact on the environment, and perhaps we'll increase the role of services in our economy. We may still have a growing economy, but if we can have a growing economy while we're moving towards sustainability and social justice, then that's fine for me.
Thanks, Warwick. Kristen, did you want to add anything? So the next question is, I'm going to sort of sum it up because there's been a few questions about bullshit jobs. And I think that both of you can speak really well to this. So I might throw to Kristen first and then on to Warwick. So one concern people often raise is that there isn't going to be, or there isn't enough meaningful work for people to do. Leslie Shuttleworth in the chat mentioned batshit construction, bullshit jobs. So are you concerned about automation or full employment creating these bullshit jobs? Kristen.
I think Warwick will speak in more detail about this, but yeah, why have wages not tracked productivity improvements? Partly because all of the benefits of those productivity improvements are going to bosses. So why aren't we working less? We should be able to be working fewer hours and still sustaining our quality of life because of all of these improvements in technology. Rather than rejecting them, we should be saying, how can we therefore do other things with our time and make everyone have a better life? So that's kind of my feeling about those kind of changes that we've seen, improvements that I would say we've seen. And what it means is you can eliminate bullshit jobs, which means everyone can work less. Again, bullshit jobs can sometimes mean you're not really doing productive work. Like some of the stuff I talked about, you know, we've got an older guy who sits out the back of a church and he makes beaded jewelry, and then he's learning nothing that will help him get a real job. That gets sent to Vietnam, and people in Vietnam have to sell it to tourists as a locally made product. So this is the kind of bullshit job, and they don't even get paid to do that work. But you can see there's a lot of work we don't need to be doing. So let's just all work less.
Warwick, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I completely agree with Kristen about working less. I sort of touched on that in my talk. I think there's no reason why the campaign to achieve the 40-hour week should have stopped. You know, there's no reason that we can't pick up that campaign and keep pushing hours down with productivity improvements. And you know, I don't see why in 10, 15 years' time we couldn't have a 30-hour work week and keep pushing it down from there. And I think that would help address many of society's current problems. You know, this is also partly about, you know, addressing the environmental impact of consumption. We have more leisure time, we spend more time with each other, we've got more time for civic engagement, got more time for democracy, we've got more time for building our communities. And all of these things are really important. I think there's a sort of epidemic of busyness in Australia. Everybody's busy, everybody's frantically sort of running around, delivering their kids to things and trying to work and juggle this and juggle that. And you know, partly that's driven by real estate, of course. You know, people feel like they have to work. You've got to have a 2-income family to buy a house in our capital cities and all those things. But yeah, I completely agree. And there are a lot of bullshit jobs in our economy, but most of them are in finance and real estate. You know, they're sort of parasitic bullshit jobs that are just draining resources from the real economy. As for automation, you know, I don't know, I'll kind of believe it when I see it in terms of really reducing the actual amount of work that's needed or available. There's plenty of good work to be doing out there. And in terms of a job guarantee and the sorts of roles that people might take on with a job guarantee, there's so much, you know, great work that could be being done, including restoring degraded land, looking after people, making our towns and cities more beautiful. You know, so much. There's lots of work that people could be doing that's really great. I think that would really contribute that currently, you know, no private enterprise is going to take on.
Thank you both. There was quite a lot of people in the chat talking about what we can actually do and what actions are being done. I think I might ask Kristen a 2-part question. One was a very specific question about charities and the use of forced labour. What kind of questions can we ask? How do we actually get that information out and put pressure on our charities to stop that or pull our support? And the other one is about what AUWU is doing about the return of mutual obligations, any kinds of actions that you guys are doing at the moment.
Yeah, great. Those are 2 great questions. And thank you so much to the person who asked about charities. So it isn't particularly easy to get information about who participates in these programs. So what I would suggest is what you kind of alluded to, call up and ask. I don't want to name any charities because I'm afraid about what might happen if I do. But if there is an organisation that you don't donate to, call up and say, you know, does your organisation participate in Work for the Dole or any employment services program? Do you have contracts or do you receive any income from employment services? If you ask that question and they can't be transparent about it and answer honestly, I would say that should raise a question for you. And of course, we're doing a huge amount of work, and what you could do is donate to us instead. So we have a lot of things that we do, specifically regarding the changes to mutual obligations right now. At every phase, so the government has continually issued very confusing and misleading statements about what each change has meant. And I might be being a little bit cynical, but the purpose of that really is to give job agencies license to bully people, which allows them to make money when people actually don't have to be doing any of these obligations, right? They've done another confusing statement coming out on Friday, just gone. We are yet again updating all of our materials so that people have very clear information about exactly what you do have to do and exactly what you don't have to do. And the reason we want to make sure people understand that is so that they can protect their health for as long as possible by doing the least possible, exposing themselves as little as possible to those job agencies. We have also said to everyone, if you get something good from your job agency, keep doing that. Just don't do anything that makes you feel bad for as long as you don't have to, and continue doing the things if they make you feel good. That's as simple as the messages we're putting out to our members. So we run a helpline, we prepare all these resources. We obviously campaign very hard in the media to defeat the dole bludger myth and to counter all of these stories. We put in Senate submissions. We're all unwaged. We don't get paid for this work. There's a core group of people who work more than full-time hours on this. And we do it because it's so incredibly important. So, you know, we always need funds to help run our systems that let us reach our members and do those sorts of things. So yeah, that's my alternative proposal, is instead of going to a huge charity, maybe fund us instead.
Smooth.
It's very cheeky of me, so sorry about that.
Smooth. No, I think that's great. And we have another question that came through private message. Can local government initiate a job guarantee scheme for a specific community? Warwick, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that was asked, because we're sort of in the very beginning of conversations about doing something very like that in our own local community here in Central Victoria. It is possible, and the model that we've been thinking about is creating our own local currency, which could be used by local government to employ local unemployed workers and get them to do climate adaptation and mitigation works in the local community. And particularly, you know, the idea that we're thinking about is getting currently unemployed workers to do environmental upgrades of existing buildings. So draft proofing and insulation are both things that, with the right training and supervision, people can do well and have a very quick payback in terms of the benefit to the homeowner. So the local government could, for instance, pay local unemployed people to do this work for people's houses, and then charge them that money on top of the rates as a sort of scheme similar to environmental upgrade agreements, if people are familiar with that. So it requires some creativity, and the sort of legal implications and tax implications of creating a currency are still relatively untested in Australia, but this is definitely an area where we can get creative. And I do think, you know, a lot of people were talking in the chat about, you know, how can we do this with this government, and we've got a government who's never going to take action in this sort of way. I do think that one of the ways around that is to go into our local communities and build momentum in our local communities and demonstrate by doing that it's possible. And I do think, you know, a local job guarantee, particularly if it's backed by council, is worth investigating and worth trying.
I think we're going to wrap there and move straight to action, and that's a really, really nice segue, Warwick. So I'm going to pass back over to Rafi, but thanks to everyone who put questions in the chat. We only wish that we could get to them all.
Thanks, Tosca. Thanks, Kristen and Warwick.